Qatar says diplomatic talks can resolve the Gulf crisis, but there's no foundation for dialogue just yet. So 1 week on since Saudi Arabia and its allies imposed an embargo against Qatar, what will it take to end this crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cherkaoui. It has been a week since one of the worst diplomatic disputes in the Gulf region began, and there have been developments almost every hour. The Qatari foreign minister has been on a diplomatic tour in Europe. He was in London earlier on Monday, then Paris to meet his counterparts. Let's take a closer look at how we got here. It all began last Monday when Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt abruptly cut off diplomatic ties with Qatar. They said it was because of the Gulf states' alleged support of what they call terrorist groups, an accusation Qatar has strongly denied. Saudi Arabia closed its only land border with Qatar, and the UAE and Bahrain cut off air and sea links. Saudi Arabia then called on all brotherly countries to follow its lead, and several did, including Mauritania and the Maldives. Turkey and Iran have begun sending food and milk shipments to Qatar. Now, these are the types of imports that used to come in through the land border with Saudi Arabia. All eyes were on the U.S. to see which side it would take. President Donald Trump initially took to Twitter to support the embargo, but then called the Emir of Qatar days later, offering to mediate, only to criticize the Gulf nation at a news conference on Friday.
The nation of Qatar, unfortunately, has historically been a funder of terrorism at a very high level. And in the wake of that conference, nations came together and spoke to me about confronting Qatar over its behavior. I decided, along with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, our great generals and military people, the time had come to call on Qatar to end its funding. They have to end that funding. And its extremist ideology in terms of funding.
But that same day, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, whom Trump had just mentioned there, was urging the GCC countries to find a solution.
We call on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt to ease the blockade against Qatar. The blockade is also impairing U.S. and other international business activities in the region and has created a hardship on the people of Qatar and the people whose livelihoods depend on commerce with Qatar.
Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE have cracked down on social media within their borders. Anyone found to be sympathizing online with Qatar could go to prison for 15 years and face a fine of $136,000. They also published a list of 71 organizations and people who they say have links to Qatar and terrorism. Meanwhile, the Kuwaiti Emir and other leaders have been mediating between Qatar and the other GCC countries. On Sunday, Kuwait announced that Qatar is willing to understand its neighbors' concerns. But throughout all of this, there have been questions and uncertainty about the root causes of this conflict. There are reports it's about Qatar having paid ransom to militias in Iraq for several Qataris who had been held hostage. But Iraq's prime minister has said the money is at the central bank and never went to any armed groups. Others say it's about GCC countries wanting Qatar to align its policies with theirs. Qatar has said this would be a violation of its sovereignty. And of course, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt maintain that it's about Qatar allegedly funding groups like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Doha, Shafeeq Ghabra, professor of political science at Kuwait University. In Washington, D.C., Mohammed, Cherkaoui, professor of conflict resolution at George Mason University. And in Beirut, Rami, Kouri, senior public policy fellow at the American University of Beirut. And welcome to all of you. So 1 week on since this all began, I'm going to put the same question to all of you, and I'll start with you, Shafeeq, here in the studio. How would you characterize where things stand right now, 1 week on?
It will get a little bit more intensive, or it will calm down. we could be seeing within 1 week some of the same situation that we see now. The Kuwaiti mediation continues, and it's a very instrumental one from Kuwait, the emir, the foreign minister, the whole structure. And on the other hand, the Qataris are moving in different directions, talking to different powers and attempting to rally support for lifting the sanctions and the boycotts and the embargo and all of that, and then trying to look for alternatives. So we're going to see much of what we have now. Could be more intensive, could be less intensive.
But still a lot of movement.
A lot of movement, and a lot of intensity in this movement is what we will be seeing. Now, there is always something that doesn't fit the analysis.
Sure.
It could be emotions or high emotions or threats of a more higher level of intensity. But overall, I see something within that intensity of diplomacy as well.
Mohammed, do you agree with that? I think intensity is a really good word. How would you characterize where we are right now?
I would like to add that this is unusual escalation and denomination, or a process of stigmatizing Qatar, and we have seen this very fast rise of all those negative perceptions and also the alleged association between Doha and terrorism. So far, this escalation has not been contained either regionally or internationally, and I agree with Dr. Ghabra. The Kuwaiti mediation seems promising, but it has not been put on the right track. Yesterday, we heard from another monarchy far in the west. The Moroccan king has proposed another mediation. So I'm wondering whether there is hope, real hope, that certain Arab capitals can promote the idea of Arab-Islamic reconciliation at this stage. Otherwise, I fear that the escalation may go as far as other capitals, and at a certain time, Gulf capitals will no longer be able of controlling the damage or trying to bring back the relationship between Doha, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Cairo, and other capitals.
Rami, do you agree with that? Do you think that where we are now, a week on, is in a situation that's actually escalating? How would you characterize it?
I think it's actually stabilizing. You might have new dynamics, new measures by both sides, new rhetoric, but it's not going to significantly change the balance of power. What's striking is how thin is the group of countries that have openly supported the Saudi Emirati embargo, and even the two important Gulf countries, Kuwait and Oman, did not join the embargo, and Oman has now opened a shipping line directly to Doha. The Kuwaitis, being noble and righteous people, are doing mediation, which is what should have been done from the first day. And if you have, Donald Trump and Abdel Fattah Sisi as your main supporters, then the Saudis and Emiratis, I think, need to be a little bit worried about what kind of coalition they've put together. And that's powerful force now is the stress on mediation. The Americans, the Russians, the Turks, the Iranians, Europeans, everybody is saying that we need to mediate, and the Qataris said they're prepared to talk about the issues that have been raised. So I think the balance is swinging a little bit more towards mediation, and mainly because it's become clear that the pressures that have been put on Qatar are not going to bring it to its knees, that Qatar has a lot of money, a lot of friends, and a lot of logistical alternatives to shipping milk and eggs and oil and gas and things like that. So I think we're going to see a turning point in the coming week towards mediation, and the critical link is going to be the American and Kuwaiti link, probably with Turkish and European involvement behind the scenes.
Okay, and you touched on a lot of things that we're going to come back to in just a moment. But first, with all of this that is going on, why haven't there been any actual concrete negotiations yet? As we mentioned earlier, Qatar's foreign minister has told Al Jazeera that diplomatic talks can resolve this crisis, but there's no foundation for dialogue just yet. Let's listen.
Our top priority in Qatar is to end this unlawful blockade, both the land and air blockade. Also to address the humanitarian issues caused by those arbitrary measures. Then engage in a dialogue and discuss the baseless accusations darted against Qatar. As of now, we have not been given a clear picture. We hear many statements, the state of Qatar must do so and so, but on what basis? We have not been given any answers.
Okay, he said a lot there, so let's unpack some of that. Shafeeq, let me start with you. He mentioned the humanitarian situation that's going on, and we're talking about lots of families that are being separated because of this blockade. What does that say to you about what the strategy or the tactic or the intent of these countries were when they put something like this in place? There's a political conflict, but the result is families being separated.
So I can't get that strategy. We've seen this strategy in the Arab world. Whenever there is a conflict, Egypt and Libya and wherever, where it goes to citizens. And unfortunately, in this part of the world, there is this generalization. The Qataris have been very measured regarding the situation. They've welcomed everybody to stay. They tried to help the students to make their exams
what does
earlier.
That say about Qatar's
That says
strategy?
a lot of good things about Qatar, in at least the way it is dealing in a very calm and semi-quiet, relaxed way. The way, I mean, I have friends, who've been living in Doha for ages, from Bahrain, from the Emirates, from Saudi Arabia. I met students who've been studying in Doha during my stay here, my brief stay in Doha, who are studying. They had to leave. It's a disaster. Businessmen and women can't follow their work, their bank accounts. And some of them have been telling me their bank accounts in the Emirates have been frozen. Their bank accounts in Saudi Arabia have not yet, but they don't know what will happen tomorrow. Let's say if they have a shipment, the shipment is now sitting in some place and they can't take it to any other place. It has to go to a non-Arab state somewhere in the world before they ship it back to Doha or to Oman. So anyway, I think what I see on the humanitarian level, there is a lot of damage. It's maybe intentional to create that damage between the people of the region. And this situation of damage will not go easily. It's creating friction between countries and states. I believe people among themselves, from all the populations, will continue to like each other, to love each other, to respect each other, because there has been a lot among the GCC population in maturing relations, intermarriages, businesses between Emiratis, Kuwaitis, Saudis, Qataris, Bahrainis, etc., Omanis. So to come and break it is not easy, but it does create that friction between the countries. So I don't see how after this particular crisis, business will go as usual. It will take effect on what we know as the GCC.
Okay, so, well, actually, that gets me to one of my other questions, and I actually want to go ahead and pivot this to Mohammed, Professor. So, Mohammed, what about that? What is at stake here when this political dispute is actually having an effect on actual people, on families? Might the long unintended consequences of this perhaps be putting the future of the GCC at risk, or is that an overstatement?
I think what applies to this situation in the Gulf is the African saying, when elephants fight, what hurts is the grass, not the elephants themselves. So I agree with Dr. Ghabra. We are looking at this extensive negative reaction at different levels, humanitarian, social, cultural, and also there is this animosity that is unusual. When Saudis are going to be sentenced to 15 years in prison because they are wearing T-shirts with the name of Qatar, or they show that they are fans of a certain soccer club, this is, I think, beyond the normal escalation or tit for tat. And I think what has been dominating so far is this irrational approach from the Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini trio in pushing far the realpolitik paradigm against Qatar. At the same time, the Qataris are trying to contain themselves, not to react in a very emotional way. At the same time, they will be hurting later on. Although we are looking at several initiatives from the Iranians, from the Turks, to help with their food deliveries. But this is not a situation where you can see some transformation or some resolution of the conflict. So I feel that it's not just the political edge that matters now, but also the public opinion across the region. And I think this is the major challenge, because how are we going to turn the situation into a normal way? And I think this will look. What I fear that if this escalation continues this way, I think that this animosity will deepen between the peoples beyond the will of the leaders. The GCC may turn into some collateral damage, and the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, even the Qataris will realize one day that the Iranian and Turkish winds will blow closer at the entire region.
Okay, so Rami, let's talk about that. Talk about the potential here for new, perhaps unintended alliances to form.
I don't think there's any potential for real alliances. I think there's a lot of potential for short-term, practical, logistical, political, and expedient cooperation among the two biggest Muslim powers, nation states in the region. And I say that Turkey and Iran are the most powerful Muslim majority countries in the region because they have the strongest base of a nation state, while some of the Arab ones, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and others are powerful countries, but they still have internal stresses which we're witnessing all the time. And the Iranians and the Turks have about 5,000 years of experience of negotiating regional relationships. So I think you're going to see a lot of participation by Iran and Turkey in regional events to try to resolve this conflict. And we've seen it happening before. I mean, you know, Qatar and Iran share the biggest gas field in the world. Turkey has a small military base already in Qatar. So these are relationships that have been there for years, and they'll probably strengthen a little bit more. The real problem here is that the GCC is showing itself to never have actually cemented into a strong regional organization, and it suffers the danger of following the route of the Arab League and becoming not really a very meaningful organization. They're very good at coordinating postage stamp rates and things of that nature, but they just haven't really brought together a political cohesion. And the biggest underlying problem for all of the Gulf countries, like all the Arab countries, is that there's very little popular participation in deciding these issues. And this is really the great problem. The Saudis and Emiratis are terrified of the post-Arab Spring waves that have rippled around the region, and they blame Qatar for it, and that blame really is not justified or verified.
Shafeeq, I have a two-part question for you. It's clear that Kuwait is really trying to take a lead in this. So why is it that they are positioned to perhaps find some sort of daylight here? And was there a time that the U.S. was the country that could find some sort of daylight there?
So why is Kuwait positioned and why is the U.S. not positioned? The U.S. is not positioned because there is a differences between the Trump leadership, if I can call it so, and the rest of the institutions, whether it's the CIA, sure, whether even now the FBI on other matters, or whether it's the Foreign Ministry and the Pentagon. They see Qatar cooperating. They see Qatar eye to eye on issues of terrorism. They see the base in the forward in terrorism against ISIS to focus. I mean, terrorism is ISIS. It's not Hamas. It's not. It's a particular brand of terrorism that has frightened the whole world. So America is not clear on what it wants, and it is in a crisis within. And there are so many issues. So this is affecting the leadership, but we also see that with NATO. We also see that with the whole issue of the environment and the Paris Convention. So now going back to Kuwait, Kuwait has been invaded in 1990-91. Before 1990-91, there was the Iraq-Iran war, 8 years, just next to our borders. We understand when a crisis happens that those who start it may not be the happiest ones at the end. We understand when a crisis happens, those who start it or those who are victims of it will all suffer, and that the suffering will be loss for everybody. And that other dynamics will come in that none of the parties that started it are able to control. So Kuwait understands this very well. Sheikh Sabah, being a foreign minister for Kuwait for decades, then he became the emir of Kuwait, understands this very well. So to take this further, look at the events. Qatar is being pushed in the direction of Iran. Power is being pushed in the direction of Iran, and we see how the food and other supplies will be, but it could take a bigger step later on if the pressure goes on. But also, it was pushed into Turkey, and now Turkey is having a base. There was never a base for a non-colonial, quote-unquote, or a non-white power in the history of the modern history of this region. Britain, America, now the Turks have come in, at least at some level, and this could increase. And we could see all kinds of access between different GCC countries affected by regional structures in a world where oil is less important and where the US is also less powerful.
And one thing that has been affected is just the movement between countries, obviously. It was affected immediately, in fact. The CEO of Qatar Airways has spoken to Al Jazeera about this diplomatic rift. Here's what he had to say.
On a positive note, let me to say that I'm delighted to announce Qatar Airways profit of $541 million. It is a record profit in the history of our airline. And at the same time, we have also had a robust passenger number growth, 20.01% increase year on year, which again is one of the strongest growth figure in our industry. So we are very resilient as an airline. However, I do agree that there are some dark clouds, and I should not be hiding my concern that yes, we will underperform, but not to the extent of our neighbors.
So as you heard there, the CEO of Qatar Airways saying that Qatar is absorbing this. Qatar as a country is trying to absorb this on a humanitarian, a business level. But what might, Mohammed, I'm going to let you have the last word on this. What might some of the ripple effects of this be, particularly when it comes to business and commerce and the economy?
Well, I think we are now living at this age of who should be in the driver's seat, politics or economics. And I think the second part is having more momentum in deciding the final say or the final decision. So I think that Qatar will undergo several losses in different fields, in different sectors, but it's not going to undermine its survival. I'm sure that there are other capitals who are now coming to the rescue of Qatari. However, my concern is not just about the Qatari economy. I'm talking about the entire system of local economies altogether. In other words, what is going to be the impact of this animosity and this closed borders between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, also between the Emiratis and Qataris. So I think we are looking at the top of the iceberg of this economic decline that is going to dominate or affect the entire region.
And we actually, I did say the last word, but we actually have a little bit more time. So Rami, I do want you to respond to this. Going forward, what needs to happen for these disputes to not keep coming up?
I think the lessons from this conflict are, first of all, we must, all of us, look at the complaints that the Emiratis and the Saudis have made and see which of them are legitimate and which of them are exaggerated emotional nonsense, and figure out how to address the legitimate ones. The Qataris are obviously prepared to do that. Anybody who is subjected to this kind of a siege would respond similarly. So we have to find out what are the underlying issues and address them. You know, if people are financing extremist groups, that financing has to stop. If private citizens are doing it, they have to be stopped. If charitable societies are doing it, they have to be stopped. And the Qataris have recognized that and have started to work on it already. The other thing we have to look at is that countries like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia need to stop assuming that they can define the entire regional order, which is what they're trying to do.
Rami, thank you very much. That will be the final word. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We appreciate it. To Shafeeq Ghabra, Mohammed, Cherkaoui, and Rami, Kouri. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Rochelle Carey, the entire team here. Bye for now.